Okay, hello and welcome to the third of our sessions today. Quite a long day, but hopefully a really good one. I've been in two mind-expanding, thought-provoking sessions this morning. We are the resilience track. We're just about to hear some talks around the theme of challenging assumptions. Prior to today, I've done adaptation. I've been in one group around adaptation, and then it's really just been super energetic today. We've had a real conversational feel to the actual talks themselves, lots of audience participation, and I'm hoping that we can create the same experience for you today. So we've got 4 speakers, 3 talks. We're having a bit of a tag team effort for one of them. Which is why you've got 4 panelists in front of you. I'm going to leave everybody to introduce themselves and give us a bit of context as to the reasoning behind their choice of topic, perhaps a little bit about themselves, what they do, to give a view on what they do in the world that makes them care about this. But the broad theme is challenging assumptions, and we're going to start with Liz Keogh. Liz describes herself as a lean and agile consultant and Cynefin, never get that right every year, Cynefin addict. I'm hoping with our kind of jigged up format, we're going to have some time to talk a little bit about that as well. Liz, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your talk.
Sure. So I want to talk today about where assumptions come from. As you heard, I'm a Cynefin addict. I've got more experience with Cynefin than Wardley mapping, though I do have more experience with Wardley mapping than I did last year. I've been at every map camp. I'm a huge fan. I said I'm a lean and agile consultant. I'm actually going back to being a developer for the first time in a very long time this year. So I'm super excited to be getting into the code. That's probably all you need to know about me, and the rest you'll get from my talk.
What prompted that change?
So I sent out a tweet early in the summer, and somebody I had done coaching work with reached out and brought me into their organization. So I've been doing it for a week. So far I haven't written any code, but I have run things from the command line, and that's making me really happy.
We've signed you up for your talk next year on that change.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
I'm looking forward to it.
The floor's yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I said I wanted to talk about where assumptions come from. I love etymology, where words come from. So it means to take something upon yourself. Okay, you can also think of assuming something fictitiously. So you might assume a costume, assume a role. And there's something about when assumptions aren't necessarily true that's really interesting. Well, I wanted to use Chris Argyris's ladder of inference to talk about how these assumptions come to be. And the first thing that happens, of course, is we act. And as we act, as we look around, as we understand our environment, that's our behavior. Hopefully, as adults, our behavior is based on the whole ladder, and there will be some stuff that's, your system to seeing data accurately because we observe the data. It's probable that like most of our stuff is actually based on the things further down the ladder. So the first thing we tend to do is we observe the data. We look around us. There's way too much information in the world for us to take everything in. It's available to us, but we filter the data through our senses and through the bias that our senses get. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. From what we see, we make assumptions, we generate theories, hypotheses about what might be going on. From that, we make conclusions, we start seeing patterns in what's around us. From that, we create the conclusions, and from that comes our beliefs. Okay, so our beliefs are our understanding of the context in which we live. And the really interesting thing is, our assumptions don't need challenging when they fit the context. They're only really a problem when the context is wrong. So Dave Snowden was saying they've started talking about these things as cognitive heuristics rather than cognitive bias, because most of the time these heuristics are actually really helpful to us. The problem is that we filter data based on the beliefs that we've generated. And the confirmation bias can lead us to continuing to hold those assumptions, even when the context is inappropriate, even when it's changing. Okay, so this is why we need to challenge at least some of our assumptions all the time, because the way in which we filter data is wrong. Now, of course, some of our behaviors are very visible. Some of them we probably wouldn't behave that way in front of other people. Some of our beliefs are espoused. We hear people say, you know, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I believe I'm a good programmer. And some of the things, a lot of the things we believe, we don't really think about. And some of those beliefs will be wrong. For anyone who thinks that, you know, I ran into somebody once actually who said, you know, I don't have any superstitions. I don't have any wrong beliefs. I said, are you married? He said, yes. I said, would you sell me your wedding ring for an identical wedding ring plus £100? Because a rational person, especially one married to a rational wife, would be very happy to do that. And he went, no, because his wedding ring had meaning to him. It's just a piece of jewelry. It's just a piece of metal. But we all have these beliefs. So hopefully that helps you to examine where your beliefs come from. So we have invisible beliefs. We have visible beliefs. There's some lovely things. Organizations do this too. So organizations will have espoused values that they say they hold, and then they'll have how people actually act. I was reading about values-based hiring and firing, where if somebody doesn't actually hold your values, you will let them go. And if you don't fire them based on your values, you don't actually hold those values because they're going to erode anyway. So we have visible values, invisible values, visible beliefs, invisible beliefs, and of course, everything being a map moves to the right. So unless we filtered it out, unless we've unlearned things and those filters have declined, you can think of those beliefs as being enabling technology, right, for the rest of what we do with our lives. So because we've got those cognitive biases, and this is true of habits as well, by the way, habits are basically actions that we no longer need to think about because we've done them so often. Everything there allows us to do other things with minimal energy expenditure. So they're enabling technology to allow the new things to come in. Okay, so there you go. I thought that, so now you know why I turned the ladder on its side. All right, so I'm going to show you a little chart, and this is not based on any science. This is just in my head. Somebody will come along and tell me I'm wrong. That's okay. This is how I think of how much energy I spend looking at different situations. So we spend quite a lot of time thinking about what will probably happen, and we gradually shift all of that stuff over to the right, and it forms our beliefs. So we've already done the thinking, eventually it dies away. But we've spent a lot of time getting that stuff into our head. We don't tend to think about the stuff that might happen, like global pandemics, for instance. Okay. And of course, when those plausible things happen to us, because we're not prepared for them, it has a really huge impact. So this is your black swan events. The really interesting thing is, we kind of know this happens, things go wrong that we didn't expect, and bang, now we're in trouble. But we very rarely think about the things which are plausible that might go right. I hear so many times people looking at what they might do in a situation and going, oh, that won't work. But you haven't tried it. You don't know whether it'll work or not. And this is one of the big reasons why we need to challenge our assumptions. Not just because of the things which might go wrong, but because of the things which might go right that we're missing out on, and which also might have an extraordinary impact. Okay, so I want to show you some tricks for looking at what might plausibly work, not just what might probably work. And of course, you heard earlier, I've got a Cynefin addiction. It's a problem. I need to deal with it, but I can't get away from it. So there you go. Now, if you haven't come across Cynefin, be careful. You will get hooked. Go look it up. I'm not going to introduce the whole thing today because I haven't got very long. What I will say is there's predictable things, clear and complicated. Predictable things have outcomes you can see coming, and the context in which you understand those outcomes is well understood. It's not changing. Chaotic stuff, it's accident and emergency, it's your house burning down, it resolves itself not necessarily in your favor, and it resolves itself really quickly. I will talk a bit about how to use chaos in a positive way, but the really interesting thing is the complexity. So human systems are complex, human beings are complex, and that means stuff emerges. Okay, so we can see with hindsight how something came to be, but we couldn't possibly have predicted it. And within the map, if you think of your Wardley map, it's kind of obvious that the custom built in Genesis stuff, Genesis actually often starts in chaos, chaotic, urgent ideas. But the custom built stuff is definitely probably more complex, and then gradually moves to something stable and predictable as the technology evolves and becomes enabling. So you can kind of see that there's an easy mapping between Wardley maps and Cynefin, but the movement in the maps is also complex, and particularly getting through the inertia is complex. Getting through inertia is a wicked problem that's often cultural. So the movement in the map, the development of these beliefs is complex too. Okay, so I'm going to show you how we handle complex stuff, and this is hat tip to Dave Snowden, who taught me all this stuff. He says we have to have a portfolio of probes. So a probe is something where you try something out that is safe to fail. Because we're not in chaos, we're in complexity, we have time to try something out. Okay, so that's the idea. If you are in chaos, you have to act and act really quickly. It might be safe to fail, but you've got nothing to lose. But if you're in complexity, you can try things out and you can see whether it's working or not. You've got some space to do that. So what you want to do is you want to have multiple concurrent probes going on. That's the ideal. Okay, so we're going to have several different things we're trying out at the same time. It's not like an experiment where you need to isolate the probe because you're going to repeat that experiment again and again and get the same results. In complexity, trying the experiment changes the context. If I poke somebody and then poke somebody and then poke somebody again, eventually they turn around and go, will you stop doing that at me? Okay, so context has changed. Me poking them twice changed how they felt about me doing that. So the context changes. We can tell in retrospect with hindsight which probe is having which effect. So we can try multiple probes concurrently. Okay, so a probe has to have 5 criteria. You have to know whether it's succeeding. How are you going to tell whether this is working? You have to know if it's failing. Might not be the same thing, might not be the opposite of the thing that you look at for success. Don't know. If it's succeeding, you have to have a way of amplifying it. That means making sure it carries on succeeding or making it succeed at a bigger scale, maybe, but you have to be able to amplify it. Otherwise, it goes away. If it's failing, you have to be able to dampen it. So stop the effects from happening, which is why we recommend, try something out at a small scale, try it with fewer people, try it with less time, less effort, etc. That's a general heuristic for safe to fail probes. So way of knowing it's succeeding, way of knowing it's failing, way of amplifying it, a way of dampening it. The 5th thing you have to have is coherence, which is a realistic reason for thinking this probe is a good idea. It has to be plausible. Instead of predictability in the complex space, we have disposition, which is how likely is it that this idea is going to work? So the probable stuff is really well disposed to work. The plausible stuff is less disposed to work, but still safe to give it a try. So you have to make sure really rigorously that that stuff really is safe to fail, because it might well fail. Okay, but if you've made it safe to fail, then it's okay to try it. Right, so it has to have this realistic reason for thinking it's a good idea. Dave says a sufficiency of evidence to progress. I always say, can you think of a scenario where this works? Because if you can, it's plausible. If you can't, you probably want to try something else. Okay, so that's your probe portfolio. There's some really nice ways of coming up with this, one of which is this shallow dive into chaos. So Cynefin has a number of dynamics in it. And one of them is if you're stuck and you can't come up with these good ideas, try separating people. So in chaos, you've probably heard that saying, always put your own mask on before you help somebody else, right? We're separated. We have to act for ourselves. We can't connect to each other. We've got nothing to lose. But it also means we're not biased. So really easy ways to do shallow dive into chaos. You've probably done it, right? Brainstorming on Post-it notes. So that you're not affecting each other. We've done things where we've taken 3 developers, I was one of them, and we independently came up with a new user interface as an idea. And we actually ended up keeping 2 of those in that situation because 2 were good, and then we refined them, we brought them back into complexity, refined them, worked on them until they worked and were really good. I learned a lot about pioneers and the quality of their code. I am a settler. I like clean code. I refactor for fun, but not that, guys. It was nasty code. I ended up rewriting bits. So lesson, if you're going to get the hacky pioneers to do this stuff, refactor it if you've got somebody who likes to refactor that stuff, or rewrite it, make it stable, because it's got to end up in that stable place. Okay, so we're going to take these ideas, refine them. If they're not well disposed, you want to really rigorously check, are they good probes? Do they meet those 5 criteria? Dave Snowden has this lovely thing called ritual dissent, which he uses to you present your probe to a group and they're really mean and attack it, and they're not allowed to say anything positive, because the idea is that it hardens it up. And also the ritual of only being allowed to say negative things means that people will more likely to say negative things, whereas if they were allowed to say positive things as well, they might be nice to you, and that's not the idea. So we're going to rigorously check that our probes are good, solid probes. Okay, right. There's a couple of other things that Dave suggests you might want to have in your probe portfolio. One of them is oblique. That means you're not just addressing the problem directly, you're looking at the ecosystem of constraints, the context around that problem, and putting yourself in a better place where that context is concerned. Okay, so for instance, if I want to introduce a method like behavior-driven development, is one of the things I teach. It gets devs and testers talking to each other, and the devs and testers are at loggerheads and they refuse to talk to each other. I will back off trying to introduce that, and I might go, okay, let's look at the quality of how easy is it to get this thing to production? Oh, it's really hard because it's buggy. Okay, well, let's try fixing the bugs, and eventually it might lead back to the devs and testers getting on a little bit better. All right, so I've not addressed that problem directly, and as a coach I tend to back off anything where people go no at me, because it's just not useful to push that. Okay, that's not well disposed, you can tell right there. I'll go at something obliquely instead, and I'll usually have 2 or 3 of these going on. The other one is what's called naive, and that means to bring in an expert from somewhere else. And I'm going to use a map to show you what happens when you do this. Okay, so we start in a map with a customer need, this very abstract map. We start with the customer need, and the customer wants to be able to do something with the thing you're producing for them. Okay, there are a bunch of other people who usually also want to be able to do things. So you'll have some security people, or they want to stop people being able to do things. That's usually what the security people want. Maybe I want to be able to maintain this code in 5 years' time. The auditor wants to be able to trace whatever we sold to the customer. We need to be able to provide proof to the regulator. There's a lot of things that we need to be able to do, and there's lots of different components. When we start mapping these components, we can think about what capabilities they enable. And I found this is a really great way of actually getting started with maps with people who aren't used to it. What are you able to do with these things? Okay. So we can start thinking about who else could use that. So rather than looking just at the customer need, we can look at what other customers we could potentially service. So as an example, I am an online bookseller. I sell online books. Who else can we use this selling bit of this thing for? Well, we're Amazon, so we're going to use it for whoever wants to buy anything else. And we've got this bit which allows us to scale our computing. Who might want that? Who wouldn't want that? Let's make AWS. Okay, so this is called exaptation, the reuse of things for purposes for which they were not designed. So you can do something that Dave Snowden calls managing for serendipity, which means introducing a bunch of experts from other domains and looking at what they see when they look at your capabilities, when they look at your map, when they look at what you're doing. So you might introduce an anthropologist or a zookeeper or a veterinarian. Dave always seems to use animal and people examples when I do this. You might introduce somebody who builds aircraft into your IT code bases, see what they pick up from it. And this is managing for serendipity. Okay, so Mel said, Conway said a lovely thing earlier. We need to get people who aren't talking to each other to talk to each other. And I thought that was just so really good. So we need to do this with ourselves as well. We need to introduce experts in different belief systems, diverse perspectives. If we do this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be people we like, but we can get plausible ideas about where we might be going wrong. And I just wanted to call out, Simon has been talking a lot about learning from China, right? And I know China's got some human rights record problems, haven't we all? But there's a huge amount that we can learn, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be people we agree with, particularly not people whose belief systems we necessarily share. Otherwise, we don't get that diversity. So I just wanted to finish with an observation of data for people who like data in changing contexts. You won't like this one. We are now at 413.78 parts per million CO2, which is 0.2 up on my last talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Start again. Sorry, that was brilliant. That was really, really good. Thank you. So first to the panel, before I say anything, and we open up to the floor. Thoughts? There's so much in there. There's a theme around black swans I want you to comment on. But first from the panel, what did you think?
Absolutely loved it. I've always been a fan of Liz, and I'm still learning stuff. So yeah, I'm taking away that probes and experiments are very much different things, and I've struggled with that. Could you, I don't know, more elaborate on it more? I'm like eager to learn more on the difference, Liz.
Sure. So experiments are repeatable.
Yeah.
In experiments, we seek to understand what we can do in the context usually of physical reality. Physics doesn't change, however much we might want it to. So we should be able to take an experiment, do it again, get the same result. When you do that with people, for instance, in a complex system, you will not get the same result. There's a lovely thing called the Hawthorne Effect, where basically they went to a factory and they watched people. They said, do these people work better with the lights turned up? And they turned the lights up and everybody worked better, worked faster. And they said, okay, let's do the opposite, because obviously we're scientists and we should turn the lights down. And they turned the lights down into another factory and everybody worked faster because they were being watched, right? So you get things you don't expect. You often get the opposite of what you expect in a complex system. And it might still be a good thing. So you have to be really super curious about that correlation with hindsight as to what it is you're seeing. Have ideas of what failure looks like, ideas of what success looks like, but don't get hung up on them, because the real outcomes will emerge and they might not be what you expect. Interestingly, this does actually happen a lot in science. There are lots and lots of products that have come from experiments where instead of yes, that works, or no, that doesn't work, the result was, well, that's funny. You know, I got a whole talk on acceptation of things that came about. Space Invaders is my favorite. As the aliens cross the screen and there's fewer and fewer of them, it takes less processing power, so they get faster and faster. That becomes a feature of the game. So there you go.
Thank you.
Anybody else before I jump into my own question, and then quite a few that we've got in from the panel? Fred.
I'm a bit curious on your view, because there's this mention that there's a big benefit in being able to experiment without the pressure and the chaos and all of that, because it gives you that preparedness. But whenever we head towards black swan, we are usually in that chaos, and it cannot always be prevented. And I'm curious about how do you transfer that pleasant pace simulation or experiment or probing into one where you no longer have that control, but the response has to still happen with a lot more uncertainty going around. Right, and the more uncertainty, the more your assumptions and everything don't have the context in which they are valid.
Sure. So Dave will probably be able to answer this way better than I can. Follow all of his stuff. It's really good. Throw constraints around the problem or get yourself out of the problem. That's literally what you have to do. So chaos happens because of a lack of constraints. Right, fire burns until it meets the constraints of no oxygen, no fuel left, nothing else to burn. Human beings keep growing their ecosystem until nature stops us, and it will stop us. Something will stop us, right? We've got to shrink ourselves back down, otherwise we're going to hit those constraints really hard. The fire will go out, and that's our civilization. So I think putting constraints around things is one way, getting yourself out the problem is the other. You've got to buy yourself some space to do things in. One of the really interesting things I found is that you can create safe spaces. Psychological safety is really important. One of the ways that I've seen get psychological safety is by repeatedly amplifying all the stuff that's working, all the good things people are doing, all the good things you see, just calling them out, calling them out, calling them out. We're not really primed to see stuff going right because we don't think about it. It just filters into the belief system and then it's gone. We see things going wrong and it makes us feel bad when we see things going wrong and then we pay attention. So you have to be very, very consciously hanging on to all the amplifying all the stuff all the time, right? And it's a habit to get into. I highly recommend it, and it helps to build that psychological safety. And then people have a base of working stuff on which they can try things out, and they know that, you know, if it fails occasionally, it's fine because the last 5 things worked. And they know that they can test it, make sure it's safe to fail. They know that people have got their backs. They know that when somebody says, hey, have you thought about this going wrong? It's not personal. The other thing is, of course, put it on a map, because as we heard earlier from a few people, I have first heard it from Jay Bloom. Simon mentioned it today. If it's on the map, they're arguing about what's on the map, not arguing with each other. So again, it's not personal at that stage. And that's just a couple of examples. I'm new to mapping, so.
Oh, it's so interesting, and I think I'm just going to have to ask your opinion here. You've got quite a few questions from the talk. Because I know that there's a particular kind of flavor around Matthias's talk, which is around not mapping, right? So having a problem, but perhaps either using a different sense-making framework versus, hey, how could everybody help me with this? So I'm wondering, I want enough time to lump some of those questions together, but I wonder if you want to, Liz, just run through some of the questions. I think we've got 4 here. If you're good at doing sort of 1 or 2 sentence answers, that would be great. And it just means we can kind of keep the question and answer contextual.
Yeah, I can see a couple around Wardley maps, identifying positive or negative black swans, writing it on a map as a component. Is it a black swan? It's when the context has changed and that thing is no longer applicable. So what you want to do is be able to spot the weak signals, the plausible stuff. I'm not going to go into detail, but again, listen to people's stories, listen to the unusual perspectives, go look at Dave's stuff on that. That's what I'll say. The flexuosity stuff is really interesting.
No, that's really good. Well, I'll jump ahead and ask one question because it's kind of related to that. How frequently and how do you iterate this process of going back? So erroneous assumptions are not necessarily useless. They were once correct. Analyzing them gives you an understanding of what's changed. How frequently and practically, how regularly do you do that? Do you want to just be pulling up maps from 6 months ago and saying, let's review every component? How would you advise people to do that in terms of both cadence, frequency, and then what, how do you prioritize what you're reviewing?
I I think the only thing that I do regularly, honestly, for myself, is try and amplify the things which I know I'm doing okay repeatedly. We're so cruel to ourselves, and it means that we're always scared of doing things wrong. So by saying, you know, here are the things I'm doing right, here are the things I'm doing well, and thank you to everybody who sent me really positive stuff, because that really helps as well. It gives me the ability to try things out, and if I do fail once or twice, it's okay. That's almost the only thing that I do on a regular basis. As far as challenging the assumptions goes, it's an ongoing thing, depending on what kind of assumptions in what kind of place you're looking for. And it's not a discrete, I do it today and I do it at 9 o'clock every morning. It's just an ongoing, complex, fuzzy thing. So for instance, I did a Harvard bias test. I found out I had ageism. I thought old people were always sick and useless. So I countered that with diverse perspectives by going and deliberately finding older role models, people who are still healthy and working and vivid. And it's made me feel a lot better about my aging as well, which is really good. I grew up with white privilege. I have various forms of racism. Again, diverse perspectives, going and finding those role models, following those people, getting that a different belief into my head. So.
Wow, we have more questions. I have now more questions, but we'll leave those to the end. I'm looking at actually our running order, and I think we changed it. So, Matthias, are you going last or next?
I'm going next.
Ah, superb. Sorry, my bad for missing that. Really excited about this specific talk. Matthias was kind enough to step in after a change in order. Life, just life basically meant we had to rejig things a little bit. Member of the community, not a very active Wardley mapper. So I thought this was a really interesting talk purely because it was almost bi-directional in terms of the help we can give. And I want the I suppose, advanced experienced mappers to be thinking as we're listening on how would you tackle some of these challenges, or how would you perhaps add value to the process through Wardley mapping. My feeling is that MapCamp is a learning experience, and it's also a great experience to be exposed to new problems, new mechanisms. So I thought this would be fun. Matthias, introduce yourself and a little bit about what inspired your talk.
All right. I'd like to share my screen, but yes, now I should be able to. If I can find it again, yes. Is that working?
Beautiful.
All right.
We're seeing your full desktop right now.
Yes. Oh, my full desktop. Oh, well, then you see my full. Doesn't matter. Well, is it a problem? Is it readable? Maybe I should try again. Let me just do that so we don't have to worry about it. How about now?
That's perfect.
Excellent. So the metaphor is an alien crashes on Earth. They have no ship. They don't know what to do. They need to navigate. So of course they draw a map. They don't know what to put on the map at this point, right? If you go in and you know what you're looking for, you know what you're mapping. But this alien doesn't know. So they start mapping whatever they see, right? It could be trees, buildings, clouds, roads, anything really, cars. And then as they are moving and using this map and changing it and trying to find a way, maybe going to the same place twice accidentally, and then they start realizing that some of the stuff is not useful on the map in their context, right? The clouds move, the cars move, unless you're a meteorologist or a traffic person, mapper or something, then those have no value to you. So this is sort of the metaphor I'm trying to use here to break you out of the idea. This is not Wardley mapping what I'm doing. It's something I started doing in, I think, 2015. It's somewhat inspired in recent years by Wardley mapping, but just to sort of break you out of that context for the next 15 minutes. So my name is Matthias Verraas. I'm a principal consultant at Aertling. We do software strategy, design, and modeling. And that's sort of where this comes from, right? I've been doing domain modeling at first at clients and design, And then you always bump into, this age-old problem. You have these good ideas, but you can't make them happen for whatever reason. So I started doing sort of guerrilla mapping, trying to, not knowing what I was doing. I was somewhat inspired by context mapping and domain-driven design, trying to capture stuff, making things explicit. And gradually that sort of grew into, well, I still wouldn't call it a proper method, but something in any case, where I'm just mapping everything. And these maps are huge and chaotic and only make sense to people who were actually involved in the mapping. So they're not really useful artifacts for others. So, and how I do it, well, you work with whoever's in the room, right? That's a starting heuristic. You don't always have the right people, but you have some people who know something. You'll never get a perfect map. I think that message has been around today already. But you try to bring in sort of a very diverse group of people and roles and opinions, which Liz was already talking about as well. And you start with what they know, right? This is the most comfortable thing for people to map. If they can start, if they're a software architect, have them map architectural components. They're product people, maybe it's features or capabilities, organization, markets, time, money, all these sort of very easily understandable concepts and easily mappable things. That's where you start. So you have sort of a frame to start putting other things in. And then you start looking for relationships between these things, right? You connect things, you overlay them. I'm talking about this in the very abstract for lack of time, but you try to build this sort of big layered map of things that are related. The tech is related to the product, and the product is related to the customers, and these kind of things. You start looking for the cow paths, right? How people really communicate in not the hierarchy, but the value creation network. Dependencies, how knowledge flows in the organization, or in the product, or things like that. And then you start, the real meat is when you start looking for constraints, right? Anything, we're talking about institutional inertia, right? Everything that's blocking us from achieving things we want, technical, organizational, decisions are maybe made or not made, or made inefficiently, existing contracts, existing legacy systems, everything can be sort of a burden on what you're trying to achieve. But then we go further and deeper, and this is the hardest part to sort of explain, because I'm trying to get people to put stuff on the map that they would never think is something you would put on a map, right? Emotions are data, right? Somebody points to one of the items on the map and says, "Oh, that's that system or that feature. I hate touching that thing." I say, "Oh, what's that?" Right? I observe. I try to pick up on these things, these little stories, and say, well, let's put that on the map. 1 dot is I don't like this thing. 2 dots is I hate this thing. 3 dots is if I ever need to touch it again, I'm quitting on the spot. And so everybody can put on these dots, and it could be anything, right? This is just an example, but fears or skills or values, you can put social constraints on there, limiting beliefs, right? So the things we tell ourselves that maybe very unconsciously that prevent us from acting in a certain way. And so you start seeing sort of these clusters of constraints that they cluster together. Constraints that maybe seem unrelated, maybe money and emotions seem unrelated if you try to imagine it. But if you see these things converge on a map in a certain location, you start sort of seeing where you might want to act or intervene or try to unblock things. I will put people's heuristics on there, right? I ask questions about, well, why did you decide that? What's your underlying belief? What's your underlying heuristic that you used to make this decision? And I'm using heuristics in the Billy von Kahn sense of, well, basically everything is heuristic. All decision making is heuristic. And you can start playing with, especially if you do digital, using a digital tool like Miro, you can change the sizes of things and move things, the relative importance of things. Find ways to do layers, which is something Miro doesn't really do well yet, as far as I know. But this is sort of what I'm trying to get on this map as well, because now all these things become very, very tangible. They become sort of items you can touch and move and point at and debate about and assign weight or value to it, or contradict to each other. If you see contradicting things, you can put them together and point at them and say, well, is this a problem? So these are, that's the role as a facilitator, right? You're not doing the mapping yourself. You're sort of observing and listening for these stories. Anything is a story, right? Any unit of cultural transmission, any belief, any sort of thing, like even body language, I will try to pay attention to in the before times, at least, when it was easier. Somebody is acting different when somebody says something. Well, there's something there that maybe we should look for. So yeah, I mentioned this, get people to map the things they wouldn't think are worth mapping. So it's a much less constraint than what I think wordly mapping is, but I can't really comment on that with knowledge. But you don't know what you're mapping yet. You don't have a legend when you start. You don't have a notation when you start. You build that notation. In fact, I appoint a legend master and a legend enforcer to make sure that there's some coherence in the legend and the map. And then, getting to sort of what I'm trying to achieve there, right? And I use a bunch of heuristics, including heuristics for challenging assumptions and for exposing them. Because a lot of the institutional inertia is, of course, because people assume things, because they believe things, because things were a certain way and maybe they're not anymore, but they assume they still are, or the other way around. So, and to find this, it helps to have your sort of backpack of reusable heuristics, right? So the method is not in the visible stuff, in the how you map or what you map or what notations or what items end up on the map or not. But it's sort of the process of going from very tangible, observable things like components or products to very sort of hidden things like information flow or decision flow or these kind of bottlenecks. So, the first thing, of course, is, well, this mapping style, if there's one rule, it's make everything explicit, right? Put everything on the map. It's easier to delete it from the map if it turns out you don't need it than it is to see it when it's invisible, right? So put it on there first. And assumptions are like that as well, right? So we put them on a sticky, we put them on a box on the map, and now we can move them. Now we can touch them and point at them and say, well, this assumption, is this true? Do we need to challenge this? How do we know? Can we do an experiment or a probe to learn more about it, right? As long as it buys us information, right? We keep doing this until the cost of finding out is higher than the cost of not knowing, right? And so a heuristic I use is, I call it assume assumptions. So assume that everything is really an assumption. We have our map, there's constraints on there, there's no money, there's no time, there's no skills, there's no whatever, right? All the constraints that block us from doing something. Well, none of these, they're all suspect, right? They're all guilty until proven otherwise. I suspect all of them of being assumptions. And then I can challenge that, right? Do we really have no money? Are we really not allowed to do this thing? Is this really in the contract? Have you looked at the contract? Even if it's in the contract, right? If the contract says we have to keep this thing online 24/7, well, does it have to be online at 3 in the morning when it's just a part of it? Maybe one chunk of data is offline for 30 minutes at midnight when our customers are sleeping, and it's all data anyway that they're not accessing, and we have numbers to show that they only access that old data once in whatever. So this constraint of we can't ever be offline, well, maybe we can have some downtime, right? A little bit as a treat, and this allows us to start creating some wiggle room, right? Because now they're not hard constraints anymore. They very rarely are, right? There are hard constraints, there are physical constraints. You can only have, a thing can only be in one place, or a person can only be in one place at a time, that sort of thing. But apart from that, there's very few real hard constraints in my experience. And this is all, anecdotal and my experience, of course. So another way for looking for assumptions, right? You might be familiar with loss aversion, right? Kahneman and Tversky, thinking fast and slow. So loss aversion is the idea in psychology that we overvalue economic loss or the risk of economic loss versus the potential economic gain, right? So we would put in more effort or make choices that optimize for not losing something. So even just framing something as a loss or a win can change people's perception on what they want to do. And usually this idea is discussed as economic loss. And again, very anecdotal, but I think this exists for much more than just economic loss, right? So what I call this heuristic is the loss aversion, right? We need to look for loss aversion, assume that everybody is afraid of losing something, and find it and make it explicit, right? It could be the work they've already done, right? We've already invested in this. Well, sure, but if it's going to be more expensive to keep doing it than do the other thing, or better to do the other thing, it doesn't matter how much work you've invested. But there's a sense of loss there, right? That you need to bring forward and make explicit. So they had ideas, they had plans, they had a way of doing things, the comfort zone that they're in, prestige. Maybe they're worried about losing their job. Well, that would be economic loss, I suppose. But so there's lots of these hidden things that people are afraid of losing for whatever reason. And it's not rational, right? But we need to look for it. And that's how you start exposing these assumptions, because there's something even more insidious happening, I think, and that is that we presuppose that other people will have loss aversion. I think it's very ingrained in our thinking, right? It's so deep in our psyche that we can't sort of see that we're doing this. So I might not offer an option to somebody because that option might cause them to lose something, and so I don't even consider it. I don't even give it the proper intellectual rigor to consider that option. So a lot of options are never visible. They never become out in the open, where as soon as an option is on the map, you can again start moving it and pointing at it and discussing it and deciding about it. But if it's not even actively in somebody's mind, then it's unreachable. I have a sort of a simple example, maybe to make this more tangible. We also organize conferences as sort of a side thing, and we had one last week actually, and called Event Sourcing Live. And one of my colleagues who was sort of on duty on the day said, "Well, my child is sick. I'm going," and we're all working from home. And my child is sick. This might be a problem, etc. And of course, we were trying to deal with it. But I said, well, next time we should just get a childcare service, maybe to pay them to take care of that, so we are at peace. And they said, well, no, because most of the time it's not a problem, right? It's only if my child is sick, which doesn't happen very often. But it's a realistic thing, right? It's plausible. So you need to think of it as insurance, that we would pay childcare even though we don't need it. But I think this is sort of a case of presupposed loss aversion, that my colleagues were worried that I would not want to waste the money on something that we didn't need. Well, clearly we did need it, even if only occasionally. So just as an example, that this option sort of didn't appear valid to people, that I might lose something as or the business or company might lose something which I wouldn't care about compared to the potential gain of hiring somebody. Oh, I think I actually accidentally unshared my screen. All right. How am I for time? Yeah, probably out of it. So yeah, negotiating constraint. Every constraint is negotiable. Negotiation is something. Don't be afraid of negotiation, right? That your superpower can be to accept that you will have to negotiate. Learn to do it well, because a lot of good outcomes don't happen because people are afraid of negotiation, right? They don't know how to do it. They don't have the skills. So learn that, teach others, and you will find better solutions together. Well, this, I feel that Liz covered it, and I learned more about it already. What I would like to add here is I see my clients sort of wanting to do experiments, but they pick such a small impactless thing that they might learn a little bit, but it means nothing, and it just sits there then, and everything else, nothing else has changed as a result of the experiment. There's a time and place for these kinds of experiments or probes, but you'll learn more when there's actually a risk of failure, right? That when there's skin in the game. So I wanted to mention that at least. So what we're doing here really is, by using experiments and interventions and trying to bring stuff in the open through mapping, is shift the Overton window, not in the sort of political extremism kind of sense, but there's things that weren't debatable because people assumed they weren't. Oh, we can't move from 4 releases per year to 100 releases per year because it would be 25 times the effort. Well, no, but they don't see that. So we use mapping, we use intervention to sort of shift the ideas of what is debatable and what kind of behaviors are now possible within the organization, which I now see as an essential part of design, because it doesn't matter how good or great or beautiful or functional your design is if you can't actually make it happen. So if there's any method, it's this, right? We look for stories. As a facilitator, you have to be the observer and the uncoverer of all these things, these limiting beliefs. We map them, we put everything on the map, cross-disciplinary, find all the people and the ideas and the concepts. It's never going to be complete at all, doesn't matter. But we see stuff happening, we see clusters, we see things happening in the same place. And now we know where to intervene, where to do experiments, where to sort of shift, create. I like doing minor victories, I call it. It's do something with a team, and at the start of the day, we decide what we're going to do, and it must be finishable by 4 o'clock before anybody leaves, right? And if this, I check, do you believe we can finish this by 4 o'clock? No, there's this week. Okay, let's make it smaller. But by 4 o'clock, we have a victory, right? It's a very small one, but we have a victory, and that's an experience that people haven't had often in these, organizations with this big inertia, that you can finish something, decide on something, and finish something in a day. It changes how they see themselves, and then of course you can start scaling that up and do bigger interventions and bigger things and bigger experiments. But it's sort of changing the story they tell themselves about what is achievable. Yeah, and that's my presentation. Thank you.
That's his first time speaking at MapCamp. Can you believe that?
Oh, and my first time talking about this stuff publicly. So yeah. It's a bit and all prepared in a week. So.
Some of you have probably heard me talk about a personal interest that just in mapping negotiations, so the specific thing of being able to visualize the components that you can use in a negotiation and to actually value them. Because when we negotiate, of course, everything is emotional, and a lot of the time we negotiate in a way that doesn't actually mean value down to us. So really interesting. The idea that loss aversion and our interpretation of other people's loss aversion are actually two distinct things that need to be measured separately. And that just goes bang into this negotiation. I'd love to talk on this more. I'm feeling by the sheer number of comments in chat that we're going to have, there's a lot of desire to talk about this. So I'm going to ask that we just dive into the next talk and then throw all of these questions into the big sort of question and answer soup that we're planning. Are you happy with that, Matthias?
Sure.
Great. So Fred and Liz, I think this is certainly my first tag team talk. I want to see how this goes down. Would you like to introduce yourselves, introduce the idea, and I suppose the inspiration behind what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so Simon approached me about doing something on challenging assumptions, and I was like, aha, I know exactly what I want to talk about, and I know I'm going to need help from Fred. So Fred and I are both engineers at Honeycomb. Boop, next slide, please. And what we wanted to talk about today is the problem that we encounter with outages and how easy it is to fall into cognitive ruts, both when you're debugging a live production incident and then when you're figuring out what happened while we were debugging the incident afterwards. And then we'll talk about some of the best practices that we've learned and what we think the evolving state of things is. And I'll maybe even show a wordly map that I made about what I think about the debugging space. Boop. So yeah, Fred is a site reliability engineer at Honeycomb. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Fred. I'm a site reliability engineer at Honeycomb. This is actually the first time I have the title of site reliability engineer. I had about 10 years of career on the software engineering side, heavy influence on operations. But for the last few years, I've read everything I could about incidents, the investigations of that, and decided to kind of shift my career around and join Honeycomb specifically for that role.
Cool. And I'm Liz. I've been in an SRE officially by job title for, I think, 13 years now. And I'm basically learning alongside the Honeycomb engineering team and sharing with the world what I learn. Boop. So we're going to tell two incidents that were really formative for both of us. This is the first formative incident. This was November of 2019. So I got an alert that was like, hey, you're having an exceptionally high rate of failures in people sending data to the Honeycomb API. And we only get one shot at getting that data, right? If we drop it on the floor, we drop it on the floor. So I was like, that's not good. But why has none of our other monitoring gone off? And not just why has none of our other monitoring gone off, like, why is it this is like a 2% brownout that's happening every 2 hours, and it's browning out for 20 minutes, taking about 1 to 2% of the traffic with it, and then it just comes back to normal? Like, what's wrong with that? And my first instinct here was there is clearly a problem with the Amazon load balancer. The Amazon load balancer is not able to talk to our backends. I'm going to ring up the phone in Amazon and get my contacts there and be like, is there a problem with the network load balancers? Spoiler alert, you can scan the QR code. That is not at all what was going on. What was happening was we had introduced a memory leak. It was, we'd restarted all the processes at once. Consumer memory, crash, 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 crash. Consumer memory, right? Like, that's what was happening. But it took 6 hours for us to figure this out, because we didn't have our system metrics in the same place as our application data, at the same place as our ALB logs. Like, this was a problem where I jumped to the wrong conclusion early. And then another engineer who had just woken up, who was fresh on the problem, like, looked at the obvious, quote unquote obvious, memory metric and was like, this is your problem, it's right there. So that was formative for me in that it caused me to recognize that you can have the most sophisticated tools in the world, but if you're not using them well, if you still have your cognitive biases. And that was kind of one of the subjects I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about some of the theory of this. Like, why does this happen? Boop. So I think debugging is really challenging because we're faced with having to make seat of the pants decisions based off of incomplete information. Boop. So I think the causes are kind of threefold. First of all, our tools lead us astray. If you don't have tools that encourage you to kind of explore and dive into your data, you're going to have a lot harder of a time than if you have tools that can let you actually poke in and understand, like, why is this happening? Not just this line wiggled the same time as this other line, but like, this is actually a temporal, not just temporal, but like, there's causation here, right? The reason that this thing took a long time is because it was waiting on a dependency, right? If you can't see that, it's really, really challenging to be able to challenge your assumptions about what's going on inside of the system. Boop. But I think, in the case of the formative outage, right, like, there's this fog of war of incomplete information. And I had been like mentally primed to think, maybe there's a problem with Amazon, I think, because we had just turned on the new Amazon application load balancers. Right. And then once I started going down this path, I had this confirmation bias, because I was like, it's got to be some kind of problem with the load balancer, right? Like, it's getting a different error, it's returning an error code that's different than the one I got from the backend, right? Like, that's clearly a problem. So I think that's one area that I think that's the other area that kind of really messed me up. Boop. Fred.
Right. So one of the things that gets super interesting there is this idea of a socio-technical system. There are multiple components in the system. There's the technical ones, the computers, the code that we ship, all of that. But really, the only way that system tends to evolve and change over time is because people working with it have an impact on it and change it and modify it and understand it. And there's this sort of feedback loop that exists between the people, the system, and the people themselves, which really has this dynamic even ecosystemic relationship in what happens, which is well coined by the term symesthesia, which is a learning system that is made of learning parts itself. And software teams are all that same mechanism of symesthesia with the people on the team that run it, the software, the tools. And there's no exactly great ways to pin that into a snapshot in time, because the moment you look into it, that information feeds back into the system and has an impact again. So really one of the things that I love to do about these is that incidents really are a perfect opportunity for that sort of learning and all the things that could really be happening. And most of the incident reviews in all companies in all cases come back with this timeline that you have. It's the thing that you have to attach onto to start looking backwards at what happened. And we have all these events that start at the top, goes at the bottom, decision points, things that happened, and then there's an incident at the end. And really, we have to walk back down the tunnel in the order of things happen, not necessarily looking back with the idea of the hindsight that we have. And the reason for this is that the errors that we find are constructed. They're not something we discovered. They're not inherent to the system. They're an interpretation of things that we impose onto the system. So we assume we have an early steady state. Things were looking fine. Things were going fine. Something happened that usually is the proximate cause, right? This blew up and we were in a failure situation. And then we do things like a root cause analysis where we walk backwards into why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Until we find an explanation that feels satisfactory for multiple reasons, whether it is because it fits with previous biases or judgments that we had, or because it's something that we feel is manageable to solve the problem and preventing from happening again. And so we come at it with a lens already. And so if you think that humans are generally to blame and automation is super good, you will find human error as a cause. If you don't like a mechanical component or the people working on it, you are likely to highlight its flaws in whatever you investigate and whatever you figure out that way. And so the reason why I want to walk back into the tunnel is that at each step of the way, there are multiple branches that might happen to a practitioner, an operator, and making calls all the time, because a decision could be going in a good way, in a bad way. There's multiple perspectives. Not everything fits in everybody's mind. The bigger the system is, the harder it is for someone to have a picture that is accurate of what is going on. And so this causes these ideas of hindsight biases, where a decision was clearly bad because it led to a failure. The counterfactual is if we had did this, then it wouldn't have happened, and we study a thing that never happened. This is a fictitious universe. We can talk about the future, we can talk about the past, but we can't really easily talk about the things that would have happened if things were different. At least it's really hard to do unless we have that understanding of all of these branches that were in someone's face, the pressures that were on them, and all of that. And that tends to come with normative judgments. The handbook or the manual, the procedure is this or that. They didn't follow the procedure, therefore they were wrong. And this causes a lot of things that are really tricky, rather than asking the question of whether the procedures are adequate to the high pressure situations, which Liz mentioned a bit in her talk and was probed again with my question on this. This is something that interests me a whole lot. And so we get into the step of documenting what happened, right? This is a bit of a representation of the timeline you might have, but we start from these events and things that were happening. And this is something that has been mentioned in one of previous talks. Failures and successes use the same mechanism. When we're walking down the tunnel, we're trying to make these decisions about which branch, which action we make. And sometimes they're going to be successful and sometimes they're not going to be. And so without knowing ahead of time what the failure is going to be, then we have to assume that the failure and successes use the same mechanisms. If your idea is that something went wrong, we have to take the person away from there. You are taking a risk because you don't necessarily know what they usually do that make this successful. And by taking away the opportunity to make mistakes, you might be also taking the opportunity to have success at the same time. One of the things that I love to do is looking into what is not visible, which interestingly ties a bit into the previous talk as well. When I see a timeline that looks like this, right, there's a big gap of takes a look, the issue is found, the fix is written. And the traditional way we like to build intuitively our reviews is to really focus on the issue was found, the fix is written, what were the mechanisms, and how were they, falling like dominoes in all of that event. What is really interesting is that incidents to me are this clash between the mental models that everyone has, a kind of implicit map that is in our head, and what the system really is like. And there's no way for them to always be agreeing between the people. And if you see that issue where you have like, this is an incident, there's a 2-hour gap where nothing is reported, no production, nothing productive is being done. This is where the repair and understanding of the world is taking place. This is one of the most interesting areas to dig into, because this is where, the mismatch between our understanding and the world already existed long before then. We put the code in production, we took the actions, it was already in place. What we realized in that gap is, the drift that has happened, and we are actively trying to bridge it to understand the sequence of events that might have happened, the things that we could do to fix it. And this is where all the very, very interesting cognitive work might actually be done.
And it's not just the stuff that's like, hey, like, here's what we found, right? Here's the answer. All of the kind of twists and turns and the things you discover along the way that didn't lead to an answer, those are important too, right? Like, and if you leave those out of your timeline, you're sacrificing a lot.
Right. Yeah. There might be something like Liz mentioned, right? We thought that this would be an ELB issue because we just changed that. Like, this is important context that tints the entire investigation about that. We call it recency bias, but it's often extremely useful because a failure that happened yesterday is very likely to happen today again, especially if we know we changed nothing since then.
Which goes to the hidden assumptions that we were just talking about.
Right. Yep. I'm very happy that this all ties very well into the sort of progression we had in talks. And so in documenting what happened, one of the things I find is key is having a generative approach rather than classification into existing labels. One of the ways that we deal with complexity as people is that we invent categories and we assign them and we wedge all kinds of facts and information into them. But there's a loss of definition in doing that. And this is the sort of map that I create with some of the incidents that we have that we find extremely interesting, that there's something happening there. And it's going to be, it's not two-dimensional. Well, it's not single-dimensional. It's not just a timeline, right? It has multiple dimensions of people working together at multiple times. Some of the things that we do is new information comes into. Sometimes it's things that annoy us, hypotheses, questions, surprises, that you can see how this has similarities with the previous talk as well. But really, the idea there is that the map itself, its objective is not to classify or provoke understanding, it's to generate new questions that we might be asking in there. Are we highlighting things that we distrust, procedures that we think don't work well in some circumstances? And we have to dig into it that way and create that sort of vision. And then what we do is that we use that map to conduct the actual retrospective. We walk through it, we use it to put ourselves in the right mindset of what was happening and discuss what was happening, what we were thinking, right? The map is not the product, it's the artifact that we use to do the actual retrospective at that point.
And you'll notice here that there's like references to what was going on in the system, how people interacted with the system, and how people interacted with each other, right? I think, that's to the core what I think is important about when you're trying to map out a socio-technical system, you can't treat each part disparately or separately.
Yep. And so we get into the challenging assumptions and the things that we can do. And one of the practices that's really interesting there for me is the idea of surfacing the uncertainty that we have. There's a tendency in hard sciences, physics, and everything, and I think software tends to borrow a lot from that, to do very large amounts of data being gathered and analyzed in depth. Humanities has a very interesting approach, which is, again, more focused on hypothesis generation, where you pick a very interesting case where you think there's something interesting going there. We can learn from that. And then you do a single in-depth analysis of that. You don't necessarily do the large amount of data gathering because what happens is that you tend to remove all the messy details. The surprising stuff gets polished off by averaging the data that you have and everything. When you do that in-depth analysis of a single case, then you can focus on all the little messy details. And over time, as you do some of them, you can see themes coming up and whatnot. But it's a real interesting one. And there's the uncertainty in how we understand the system, but also how we communicate it to each other, which is where you compare and understand the mental models that people have in there. Psychological safety has been mentioned already. It's absolutely critical, because if the idea is my understanding is not the same as yours, there's a required vulnerability to communicate that properly. And then, you can test them. Chaos engineering is one of the approaches for that. And the quicker feedback you have, the better ability you have to correct and course correct and change your models.
And this actually ties in nicely with where we think there are problems with the state of the art in incident analysis, right? The kind of in-depth analysis that Fred did of that one incident, he wouldn't do it to all of our incidents, right? But it's important to do it for illustrative, like 1 or 2 incidents. And it gives you a depth that you just cannot get from saying, okay, here's the TTR for, these 5 incidents or these 10 incidents, right? Shallow incident metrics don't surface these kinds of deep problems that are in the relationships in our systems. So I think that goes to where we stand with regard to the wordly mapping of our space. Like, my view is that we're still at the bespoke and artisanal phase of doing incident analysis. There are standards for doing this, right? It is regularized in the aircraft safety industry, right? This is exactly how you do an incident analysis. This is how you file a CARS report with NASA, right? Like, and as much as I like the folks at Blameless and Jelly, like, I think that it's a little bit premature for it to be in the mainstream just yet. That we're starting to, do the knowledge sharing with things like the Verica Open Incident Database, but like, we're not yet at a stage where you can just productize something and saying, here's a process, go run it at your company, it'll just automatically work. Like that's just not the reality where we are today. Boop. So here's a map that I drew, which basically outlines kind of how all of these production technologies relate to each other, right? When we think about software delivery and software reliability, it's something that is bespoke to every organization, right? We have some idea of how to do it, right? Like we're not inventing it from scratch, but you have to do it custom in-house. And you might rely on, your Lambdas, your EC2s as kind of your utility hosting, right? It's just a metered connection that you get your stuff through. But we don't think that the traditional ops model is working, right? Yes, you can go and, you can go and get off-the-shelf monitoring tools. They're not going to help you with the deep incident analysis and understanding exactly what happened inside your system. You can go and hire a network operations center from Tata Consultancy Services, right? They'll happily take your pages, but that's not going to solve your reliability problems. So some of the things that have become utility or that have become commodities and standardized things, like they're not helping us. But the things that we do think are helping, right? Like from most mature to least mature, right? CI/CD tools, right? Everyone knows you need to be able to deploy your software to production consistently, whether you're using, Team Cities or like whether you're using, Circle CI, right? It doesn't really matter. There are a variety of tools that can do that for you. But I think that, when we think about the SRE and DevOps practices, there still is a range of people figuring out, like, how do we do this? How do we do SRE and DevOps practices, right? It's just as messy as software delivery. There are some norms in the industry, but they're not, you cannot just go and off the shelf get an SRE or get a DevOps, right? Like you're not going to get what you expect. And then what do those SREs and DevOps practitioners need, right, to be successful? I think the answer is you need observability tools to be able to figure out what's going on. And, I think that we're at a stage where that is suddenly experiencing explosive growth. It's experiencing kind of this traction in the market and the emerging standardization of it. So this is why we're seeing like venture funding. We're seeing projects like OpenTelemetry to kind of bring to grips all the stuff that's not as bespoke. But I think incident analysis is something that, despite the fact that it is super standardized in the airline industry, you cannot just, pour it over and say, if it's standard in one industry, it must be standard in all industries, right? I think here it is much more towards the genesis where we are. And then kind of towards the bottom of this, right, like with regard to, you can have a little of downtime as a treat, right? SLO tools are only as good as the incident analysis and observability that they're built on. Again, you kind of can't quite standardize it yet. There's kind of no one formula for what makes for a great SLO, such that you can stamp it out everywhere. So that's what we had to share with you today, which was kind of our view into two formative outages and how we analyze them afterwards, and what we learned about how other people can view incident best practices and challenging their assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you both. So I was on mute there. Again, just really insightful. I love that there's always a mix of big idea, take this away, you don't know what to do with it, but you'll be thinking about it for a couple of years. And then we have talks which are really specific, and I think people can take something and actually apply it to their work the following day. So thank you so much for that. Like we said earlier, I'm just going to open the question and answer to everybody. And for the next, 20 minutes odd, or 15 minutes odd, we'll just have a basically open chat around everything that we've heard. We'll start just by asking the other panelists for any of their burning questions, ideas. You may have seen some themes that sort of relate to what you've spoken about. So who wants to go first and just give any thoughts or ideas?
I had one question.
You did. Go ahead, Liz.
I did. So to Liz and Fred, do you have any story around what's the worst bug that you prevented with this approach, or the worst problem you've uncovered before it actually hit you?
Oh, we have many of them. I was writing reports recently. We had tough operational September and October, and I think we had something like 20 near incidents for every incident that hit the public. Like, a lot of it is there's this delay between when something happens and when it becomes critical and noticeable to people. One of the noticeable ones we've had at Honeycomb specifically was one where our main Kafka cluster was nearly running out of memory. And I was just, a fly on the wall during this one, but it felt like these TV shows when there's a bomb and you have to cut the right wire at 1 second before it explodes. And it was literally that. We saw the disk filling up 90%, 91, 92, 93, 94, and having the right command with the right syntax hit at 99%, and then disk was freed and bought us some time. So a lot of it felt, it's not as exciting as the actual action movie, but it felt like a real equivalent to that. And nobody saw anything of it outside of the company. But the magnitude of the response is not necessarily, in direct relation with the risk that is seen and the actual impact that is seen. In many cases, what we see is tons of near incidents, which means that, to me, the process is working. There's a lot of complexities, things bubbling up, but generally the notice of it is quick enough and the action is interesting enough, or mitigation, that it doesn't become an actual incident. It's just very close to it, same reaction, not the same impact.
Yeah, although it does have an impact on our people, right? Like, we do set an upper bound for the number of incidents that we hope to have, because that impacts the way, the extent to which people feel burnt out, the extent to which they feel tired. But at the same time, you shouldn't be penalizing people and saying, oh, I'm going to dock your bonus if you declare more than 20 incidents this month. This means that people are not going to declare incidents, right? The other really fascinating thing about that Kafka thing, right, was that we had built-in safeguards to the system, such that there was the wire you could cut to defuse the bomb, as opposed to seeing the bomb just ticking and ticking and ticking and not being able to do anything about it until it exploded. Right? In this case, we had the safety option to say, keep less data on local disk, tier more of it to Amazon S3, rather than having to completely rebalance our cluster and turn up new nodes. We had that safety margin to say, okay, cut retention from 3 hours to 2 hours on the local cache.
Right. And one of the attitudes that's interesting there as well is this idea that the incidents are a normal outcome of complex systems working in. And this ties into the blamelessness, but the operator or people doing operations they're people standing on the tip of the iceberg, right? Of where all the previous decisions and the current running of the systems come and clash together. So anything to me that has to do with, the operator messed up, something didn't go right, or of that front, is looking into a tiny, tiny portion of all the organizational pressures and dynamics that exist. And we're only looking at the tip and seeing like, oh, if we shaved out the top of this iceberg, then everything would have been fine. It's not necessarily effective. And so incidents are a normal outcome that we have to learn from. They're not necessarily preventable. It's just an opportunity to learn.
Thank you. I really love that observation of incidents as being something which are inevitable if you're going to have any kind of innovation. I agree. Really great.
Is there a story just around mapping? And I suppose another level, the pace, I suppose the incentive to always drive to go faster. Is there something, so as you were speaking, I was thinking about the act of mapping and the fact that you will record components, you will record influences that perhaps are forgotten in that long run. So when you are doing the sort of post-mortem, it's much easier to take a 6-month-old map and say, it's that thing, than it is to go through all the logs and resurface that again. And then the larger piece of where we have a profit motive and we are always looking to move fast, to move better, is there a lesson in how fast we should be moving and practices that perhaps we could build in to make it easier to go back?
So one of the things there is how fast we are moving, I think, tends to be a false solution, right? By the time the incident happens, the mismatch that we have between our mental models, what to me is a map, it's just not on paper, and the actual system is already existing, it's already there. The reason the incident might happen is that clash is highlighted by actual events stressing and trying the system. Going slower is not necessarily something that makes it safer. It might just delay the inevitable of, the map taken as the territory and the way it is right now and these decisions taking place. So counterintuitively, one of the good practices is trying to go faster so you don't have the time to have your map age out as fast as possible in these cases. Chaos engineering tries to do it in a controlled way. Continuous delivery is one of the approaches where you narrow your feedback loop, but to me personally, one of the core elements is the duration of that feedback loop. The shorter it is, the easier it is to say, like, the way I took this action doesn't fit my mental model, and you can correct it gradually and continuously as a habit.
Right, which is actually one of the things where one of our incidents that we had in the past month was caused by our automatic retirement of one Kafka node per week. Right. And I think that, yes, we could have not broken that Kafka node every week, but instead we would have discovered it at 3 a.m., on some Sunday in November, some months down the road. But instead,
possibly during another incident. Possibly during another incident, and then everything is worse, right?
So yeah, the more you continuously refresh that, the better you will have knowledge to act.
Matthias, I'm guessing that as that talk was going on, you were seeing a lot of commonality between what you were talking about, but you're the expert. What did you think of that? And were there any areas of overlap?
Yeah, well, definitely the sort of making it explicit. Something I didn't do is express or talk about is expressing time through maps, but that's of course what you are doing all the time. But I do come from sort of the event storming community as well, where we're expressing everything as time. When it comes to these sort of maps and history, etc. My general idea there is that you express time simply by doing another map, because keeping track of everything, it can be, it's a job in itself. People don't necessarily want to invest resources in maintaining history and keeping that organized and searchable and findable. But if you keep mapping regularly, you're doing sort of a very deliberate act of knowledge transmission every time. So the shared artifacts, it's the understanding that people have, the shared knowledge, the shared mental models. Yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking about. Yeah, I'm usually when SRE, I don't know anything about it and at all, except from what I read in books like Drift into Failure or Richard Cook. But because as a designer, I'm sort of and especially one that they bring in from outside, I'm the first session they cancel when there's a crisis, right? We have no time for design or improvement or anything because we're dealing with this crisis. And the crisis, as you were sort of saying, Liz and Fred, is the end of the illusion, right? The situation was always there. But what I learned from Dave Snowden is that it's exactly the time when you need to bring in the designers. You have two task forces. One, to solve the problem at hand, to put out the fire, and immediately, while there's sort of momentum and motivation for people, start putting up, creating teams to solve the problems in a deep sense, right? And sort of look at where is our design wrong, where is our understanding wrong. If you wait until usually it's sort of, first fix the crisis, and then we'll work on these things that we've known for a long time that we should have fixed, but we never did. But then the crisis is over, and you're actually, it's not really over, but you're still cleaning up stuff, I imagine, and then you're also trying to catch up.
And if you have too many crises in a row, right, you punt doing the cleanup, and then you just keep on, right? Like it's this vicious cycle.
Yeah, so you never get into but it's when the crisis is there, right when Facebook was down, somebody should have, put a lot of money into a new team to, well, I heard it was DNS, solve DNS problems, or think of a new way to do that, like foundationally. So yeah, that's sort of a shame that the design is seen as the luxury as opposed to the necessity. So that's also something I was thinking about during your talk. I loved it, by the way.
No, really good. We have loads of questions. By the way, I note that Liz went through and diligently answered some questions already in the chat. So it's worth reviewing those. If you haven't noticed they've been answered, you might find that actually you've got a question that you wanted to ask that's already been dealt with. I'm looking back, so I could see so much going on in the chat. It's a little bit hard to track because some of the questions are in the main chat. If you leave me, I have 4 minutes. If you leave me to look through that and surface them, talk amongst yourselves, perhaps you've seen a question that I haven't noticed yet.
We've got one actually in the Q&A box right now for myself and for Fred. The question is, how do you facilitate your teams to evolve those mental models continuously and ensure that there's coherence between different people's mental models?
There's plenty of ways this happens naturally, right? The incidents and the review and the retrospective itself, if you are able to do the proper type of facilitation, it highlights this idea that someone comes in as like, what was surprising at the time? And it's not necessarily surprising from everyone, but that's the kind of sharing context it gives it to you. If you don't have it at a proper pace with incidents, and chaos engineering is one of the interesting ways to do that, where you introduce or induce these errors on purpose, which is similar to probing, and having these discussions is a great way to do that, and frequently do simulations. One of the really, really great things that Honeycomb does is that every time there's a batch of new hires, there's an architecture overview of the system, and the people giving the architecture overview is always a different person, usually someone who was in the last overview. So if you had your education last year, giving it next time around, and sort of forcing that discussion of what changed since last time, and anyone is free to come there. So
it's really awesome, right? That we make the second newest person teach the newest person, and then there's kind of the bet on which dog will you forget. All of our services are named after dogs.
So for a lot of these, I think it's, you can't transfer a mental model. The thing you can do is force people to, guide people into comparing and contrasting, and that's the way you kind of highlight the differences and course correct on the understanding that we have our systems.
Brilliant. There was a question that's been answered and dealt with by me, but it was about adding the time as a third dimension, which from a graphing perspective, I thought, well, that's actually a useful, great idea until you think about what most 2D maps look like. And I thought adding a third dimension that you need to move through, unless you've got some way of only looking at one slice at a time. I think, Liz, you mentioned the stop motion, sort of where you're doing it as an animation. But we are coming up to time. We've got 1.5 minutes or so left. Some people missing some messages. What I've tried to do, everybody, is take the text of what everybody's spoken about. So if we have some way later to sort of post up the actual questions, we will have a record of them. Color and shape as a way of noting time too. Yeah, is that less complex? As in, once you add 3 colors, is it any, I suppose it depends on how you view color versus space or whatever, but interesting sort of visualization problem. How could you express time? over that. And actually one theme for me today has been that I've always seen, I take a static and I describe the movie. So seeing a change isn't obvious. Someone's got to describe this thing move that way to that point.
And all maps and all diagrams inherently compress information and drop some. And so the question is there a point you're trying to make, and what it is that you're keeping and trying to communicate? And you might need multiple of these maps because one map cannot contain itself, right? There's information you keep, information you drop, and that has to be a conscious decision with some position you're taking.
Indeed, all maps are imperfect, and it's really about representing the most important thing, or the most useful thing. Well, look, we are at time, and thank you so much. There are loads of questions. I will do my best to make sure everything is at least published and available. I'd encourage everybody look for the speakers, and follow them on Twitter, whatever channels that they're using, purely because it's a much richer way to sort of follow what they're saying, look at previous work, future products, and hopefully we'll see all 4 of you here next year for your next talk. By the way, Matthias really wants a job at Facebook, so if anyone has any contacts.
Only in the board, only in the board.
In jest.
To shut it down.
Only a joke in case you do work at Facebook, somebody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.